the new leader has been chosen and the people have not been consulted. But that's enough about Britain. Because we're here to talk about China, which, let's face it, is a lot more important.
This will really tell us that we're now going to be facing a China that began to looking inward and become far more interested in fixing its own domestic economic woes, and become far more interested that looking at the world slightly in a more dangerous way, looking at the world slightly in a more cautious way, no longer really just open arms, like embracing the foreign direct investment, like what we have experienced in the last 40 years. So that really setting the tone of this Congress. I mean, regardless of what happened on stage at the People's Great Hall of the People on Saturday, I mean, really the condition of Hu Jintao, I have absolutely no idea. But really judging from the composition of Standing Committee of Politburo, so the team of 7, at the apex of power, and also judging by the composition of Politburo, that team of 24, by the way, not 25, 24. For the first time for 20 years, since 2002, 16th Party Congress, we have now have an even number Politburo, which means the time when you come to casting a vote on important issues such as Taiwan, and you probably can't make a very quick decision because you have an even number, not odd number for that. Now, secondly, this Politburo and also Standing Committee is full of convention-busting nominees. So there's 3 conventions that's been broke as of yesterday. Firstly, the age limit. We all know that for the age limit, for those who at age of 68 should really step down, and for those who are 67, you got promoted and you whether stay for the next 5 years or so on and so forth. But that did not happen yesterday. So yesterday what we had is we have someone who's extremely close to Xi Jinping at the Central Military Commission, and he's aged 72 and got confirmed to stay at the Politburo. And we also have the current Chinese foreign minister, again, he's age 69 and got allowed to stay in power. So that is one age issue for those who should be promoted, but younger, but asked to leave. That's one convention being broken. Now, the second convention in here is you're always supposed to have a woman at the Politburo, the equivalent 1992 committee of the Chinese Communist Party. But for this time, we have absolutely not a single female had made to the Politburo at all. And again, I think the last time we had this was probably about 30 years ago. So that's another mess. And the 2 likely contenders, I think the reason why they got turned down is because the 2 likely contenders are not have been occupied in a high office for long enough. So that's the reason why they did not really get promoted. Now, last convention in here is quite interesting, is this very surprising appointment of someone who is supposed to be in charge of the Chinese economy, but has never run the state council, has never worked within the state council, which is the equivalent of the Chinese government. So you have the party, you have the government, you have the Chinese government. The person have not really run the government, the central government, have only run Shanghai, and tipped to be promoted as the premier of the country in charge of the economic planning. And judging by his record, I mean, I can only judge by result. It's a really a mixed responses what he has handled. Firstly, someone who's very close to private sector. So he used to be friends with Alibaba, with Jack Ma, because he ran provinces like Zhejiang, Jiangsu, and Shanghai, which is the equivalent economic powerhouse of China. But on the other hand, given his mishandling of the lockdown in Shanghai, this really could somehow foreshadow his premiership by running the Chinese economy. So again, whether he was able to coordinate and facilitate that sense of cooperation between Xi Jinping and himself and State Council, that would really remain to be seen. So I think there's 3 convention-busting things which really take me by shock. Now, another thing which really taking me by shock in here, on the very final point, is that we're now having this Politburo of 24 people, and 7 of them have earned a PhD in natural science or environmental science, and they earned that PhD themselves from the very, very early age. And they are either nuclear specialist or the person that designed China's first spacemanship and sent it to, so a rocket man. And then you also have someone who's deeply care about environment, and someone with a PhD degree from Imperial College, and now sitting on the Politburo. So that really tells us this is going to be a country that's going to formulate policy. It's not just based on economics and finance like what we had in the past, but instead, it is a policy that we're going to have is the policy that look into technology, the policy that deeply look into education, the policy that deeply look into fixing its own domestic problems. So it is not something that deeply popular among the foreign investors, but perhaps that's what China is needed right now.
I should start by saying that I'm not in Beijing because the Chinese won't give me a visa. And that is because the State Department and the Chinese government are locked in a tit-for-tat, deny journalist visas to one another. And that, to me, is a symbol of how uncooperative and scratchy the relationship is. And neither side seems to want to give an inch. China is at the moment also not being very generous with visas with foreign journalists, probably because it doesn't really want more foreign scrutiny. But that does mean that I'm locked out of what ought to be my posts, and I'm not the only one. This region is full of journalists who should be based in China, who can't be based in China. They're either here or in Hong Kong or in Taiwan. And that really bodes very ill for the future, because the number of people who are really in China, eyes on, reporting to the West, has diminished drastically during COVID-19. And it doesn't look as if it's going to reverse itself anytime soon, even though probably the COVID quarantine restrictions and so on might lighten up, but that doesn't mean that journalists will follow or be able to come and go freely. I was in Hong Kong during the party conference, and what struck me was how the Hong Kong government, certainly the people, were watching with huge interest and some uncertainty. I think because after the democracy protests in Hong Kong, there was a lot of talk about how China had cracked down and enacted the Basic Law and basically snuffed out freedom of speech. That's all true. But Hong Kong is still not China, so that I, on a British passport, and my cameraman on an American passport, could go in visa-free. I mean, that's extraordinary. China is just not like that at all. But the Hong Kong government is still trying to maintain its separate system, one country, two systems, but very much sort of trying to keep Beijing happy. And you can see it in the way their COVID is a sort of zero COVID light. They try and please Beijing, I think, and try and play the game, even though in so many other ways, like visas and for example, like the opening up of the country to foreign business is quite radically not like China. And I was just struck by how Hong Kong is on edge and not quite sure what to expect from China, even though nominally it's part of China. So I'll stop there.
I think at times like this, journalists tend to write that this is a watershed moment. And I'd like to just try to refine that a little bit according to what I think. I think it is a very major watershed moment politically for a lot of the reasons that Yu Jie has just mentioned. But I don't think it's a watershed moment economically or strategically for China. Perhaps I can just go into those a little bit. I don't want to repeat what Yu Jie mentioned, but politically, obviously, Xi Jinping gets a third term. That is unprecedented since the days of Mao. And also breaks all kinds of precedent and conventions in who he chooses, the makeup of the Politburo, what the jobs of the key 7 members of the Politburo are going to be doing, and what experience they have. All of that is different. He's tearing up the internal rule book in China. And I think that's important as a statement by itself, because I think that shows the kind of person that we're dealing with here. Xi Jinping is not somebody who is going to allow niceties, legal or otherwise, to restrain his actions and ambitions in the world. I think that's the key point. So politically, it's a massive shift. This stuff is really very important in China for all kinds of reasons, hopefully we can discuss. Economically and strategically, I think what this Congress represents is a reaffirmation and an intensification of really important world-changing trends that, if you've been watching China, you would be aware of. So, economically, China is building a fortress economy. In other words, more self-reliance, more indigenous innovation, stripping out reliance on virtually any foreign technology that China can manage. Of course, the big vulnerability here is semiconductors, but I'm sure we'll discuss that. Basically, I think what Xi Jinping is trying to do is to build a techno-authoritarian state, by which I mean a world-leading technological power. And I believe that people might be quite surprised to know in how many areas of technology China is already leading the world. I won't go into a long list, but we can discuss that. It really is a technological peer or rival, or in some cases already overtaking the US. And I expect, Xi Jinping's ambition is to redouble efforts in that regard so that China becomes the unassailable technological leader in the world. And personally, I wouldn't bet against him being successful. But, this process will, as I mentioned, require much greater self-reliance, much greater reduction on outside influences. So I'm talking about import of food. I'm sure there's a climate change element to this. Renewables, obviously China needs to deepen its reliance on renewables so that it can reduce the 20% of its energy that it currently gets in seaborne oil imports, because that represents a strategic vulnerability with the rest of the world. Lastly, strategically, I would say what we're going to be looking at is an intensification of current trends, which means much greater tensions over Taiwan and in the South China Sea. Effectively, I think Xi Jinping is trying to build a country that can withstand a war. Please notice I didn't say prepare for war. I said withstand a war. In other words, it's not my belief that China wants to have a war with Taiwan or the US, but it is prepared that might be the eventuality. And I think the date for this, such a calamitous event, has probably been brought forward over the last, several months. Certainly what I've been hearing from Chinese sources in the last month or two suggests that maybe the thinking for such, the date for such an event has been brought forward. However, just three big risks to this scenario. First, obviously, is what I've just been talking about, the risk of conflict with Taiwan, conflict in the South China Sea, even potentially superpower conflict. The next one is that all of these economic policies may not drive growth or engender growth. They could actually smother Chinese economic growth. And that's going to be really bad for the world because China's contributed way more to global growth than any other economy, about 25% over the last decade. So that's not something I think people should look forward to, but it is beginning, I would say, to be a believable scenario. And the last thing I think is related to the economic picture, which is the huge gulf now between rhetoric and reality, by which I mean China is decoupling economically from the outside world, and everybody's writing about this, but much fewer words are spent writing about the reality, which is that we are very much coupled. I was buying kettles over the weekend, ended up with a very nice brand, I must say, but I looked at all of the kettles, they're all made in China. There's no decoupling going on whatsoever in John Lewis or Curry's or B&Q, right? So I think, we need to recognize the fact that there is a massive gulf between the rhetoric and the reality, and if we follow the rhetoric, we are headed into a very big disruption.
I think, again, that's not new. We're seeing a deepening of that trend, but so-called dual circulation has been a policy for some time. And that is about China being resilient in terms of potentially hostile external pressures. And I agree with everything that's been said about the trends. I think it's important to understand what tearing up the rules means. Xi Jinping has torn up the rules. Who wrote the rules and why were they written? It was essentially Deng Xiaoping who wrote the rules, and he wrote them in order to avoid having an ideologically dominant and politically dominant authoritarian state, led by a personality cult. And guess what? This is beginning to remind me of the China that I first knew decades ago, which was the tail end of the Mao Zedong era, when ideology was in command, politics was in command. We're hearing echoes of this language absolutely everywhere. Now, that's in a sense China's choice, although who chooses, of course, you could contest. But what Xi Jinping is creating is a state in which, China is the party and the party is Xi Jinping. And the potential dangers of that, I think we can see from any number of previous examples, including previous examples in China, where you have a system which in some ways can get things done, where I'm often asked on the climate front, where aren't there advantages in having a top-down system? And, in some ways there are. We can exaggerate how effective it is in China. But the downside is that it finds it extraordinarily difficult to self-correct, that when things go wrong in a system like that, when the wrong decisions are made, it takes a very long time and a lot of damage has to be done before the system can pull back. And, again, from the Mao Zedong era, there are any number of examples, the worst of which was the Great Leap Forward. But I would argue that zero COVID is one such. We're still in zero COVID in China, and we're in zero COVID in China not for particularly good reasons at this point, but it is heavily identified with the great leader, and so it is extremely difficult to change, to correct, and what happens in those circumstances is that officials at every level across China over-enact the policy in order to please the boss and demonstrate their loyalty. So the kind of qualities that you need to demonstrate to thrive in that sort of system are not necessarily the ones that are good either for the local economy or for sound policy making. So that's a big danger. The second trend that I think we see deepened in the 20th Party Congress, again not a huge surprise, is the securitization of everything. And again, that's been kind of building. So the number of things which are now described as matters of national security go from, feminism to LGBTQ questions to any kind of divergence of opinion. These can all be described as national security. Again, we saw it enacted in Hong Kong in a rather brutal kind of lesson in how you bring a very vibrant society like Hong Kong into line. But of course in China, this is now pretty standard fare. And I'm sure my fellow panelists have had the experience of, the falling away of Chinese contacts and friends and conversations, the thinning out of people-to-people contact, because it's simply, people are rightly concerned about the consequences of talking to foreigners anymore. And that's not great for China's relations with and understanding of the world, or the world's relationship with and understanding about China. On the personnel, I did note that Chen Chuangguo, who was the man who brought Tibet and Xinjiang in particular into line, talking of security, was retired. I don't know, perhaps he's fulfilled his purpose, but he's no longer there. It was early retirement, yeah. He didn't have to retire, so he was retired, and that's an interesting one. On the other hand, Wang Hongning, who is the chief ideologue of the Xi Jinping era, is still very much there. So those are kind of slight bellwethers. On my particular topic, it was disappointing to note how little mention there was of climate. China has aligned its industrial policy in many ways towards climate change. It's not that China does nothing. China does a lot. The mitigation side, however, has slowed down, again for energy security reasons in the last 3 or 4 years. There was talk of coal, again, a promotion of coal as some kind of clean fuel, which is disappointing given how much coal China burns. So in that sense, we can see other concerns overtaking what had been quite a kind of powerful signature policy of Xi Jinping. He was pretty front-footed on climate, but again, we're seeing a correction because of geopolitics. Shall I stop there?